3 black passengers removed from flight over a shocking complaint. What happened next changed everything. Emmanuel Jean-Joseph stood in the bustling airport terminal, double-checking his boarding pass for the 3rd time. His heart thumped with a mix of anxiety and excitement. Dressed in a sharp charcoal gray suit that complemented his dark complexion, he was every bit the young professional ready to seize a life-changing opportunity. The upcoming job interview in New York could catapult his career to new heights. Elsewhere in the terminal, Alvin Jackson hugged his carry-on bag to his side as he navigated through the crowds. His warm brown eyes glanced at the family photo on his phone, a reminder of the loving wife and 2 children waiting for him at home. A successful conference had wrapped up, and all he wanted was to be back with his family for the weekend. His navy blue blazer and neatly pressed shirt reflected his meticulous nature. Meanwhile, Xavier eased into a seat near the gate, his fingers drumming lightly on the worn leather case that housed his art portfolio. His deep ebony skin contrasted with the vibrant burgundy shirt he wore, a subtle nod to his artistic flair. The solo exhibition awaiting him was a milestone he'd been working toward for years. The 3 men, all black and strangers to one another, eventually boarded the plane, each settling into different seats scattered throughout the cabin. Emmanuel found his spot near the front, Alvin took a seat over the wing, and Xavier nestled into a window seat toward the back. The hum of passengers stowing luggage and exchanging polite greetings filled the air. As the plane began to fill, a subtle tension drifted in. Flight attendants exchanged fleeting glances as the middle-aged white passenger whispered something to one of them, casting wary glances in the direction of each of the 3 men. The lead white-skinned flight attendant nodded, her expression becoming tense. Moments later, Emmanuel looked up to find a flight attendant standing beside his seat. "Sir, may I speak with you for a moment?" she asked, her tone professionally detached. Confused, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. "Is there a problem?" "Please gather your belongings and come with me," she replied without offering an explanation. A few rows back, Alvin noticed 2 flight attendants approaching him. "Excuse me, sir, we need to discuss a matter with you before takeoff," one of them said. Similar scenes played out with Xavier at the rear of the plane. Gathering their belongings, each man was escorted off the aircraft separately, their paths converging only as they stepped back into the gate area. They exchanged puzzled glances, but remained silent. At the gate desk, the lead flight attendant addressed them collectively for the first time. "We're sorry, but due to a passenger complaint, you will not be able to continue on this flight." Emmanuel's eyes widened. "What kind of complaint?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "A passenger reported an unpleasant odor, and we've determined that it would be best if you took a later flight," she said vaguely, avoiding direct eye contact. Alvin felt his face flush. "Are you kidding me? We don't even know each other. How could we all be the cause?" Xavier's hands clenched around the handle of his portfolio case. "This is ridiculous and discriminatory," he said sharply. The flight attendant stiffened. "Sir, there's no need to make this difficult. We're offering to rebook you on the next available flight." Passengers passing by began to take notice, some slowing down to watch the unfolding scene. Emmanuel took a deep breath, his strategic mind racing to process the situation. "We have important engagements we need to reach. Removing us based on a vague complaint is unacceptable." Alvin glanced at the others. "This feels an awful lot like we're being singled out for no valid reason." The flight attendant's professional facade began to crack. "If you refuse to comply, we'll have to involve security." A tense silence hung in the air. The 3 men, united by circumstance, shared a moment of mutual understanding. They were being subjected to a familiar yet devastating form of racial discrimination. Finally, Emmanuel spoke up. "We won't cause a scene, but we won't let this go unnoticed." He pulled out his phone. "I think it's time we documented this incident." Xavier nodded in agreement. "People need to know this is still happening." As they were escorted away from the gate, Each man wrestled with a mix of anger, humiliation, and resolve. Unfamiliar with each other only a few minutes ago, they found themselves bound together by an unfair experience. The fluorescent lights in the airport waiting area cast a sterile glow over the rows of plastic chairs, amplifying the starkness of the moment. Emmanuel sat upright, his back perfectly straight against the unforgiving chair. His tailored navy suit was immaculate, a shield of professionalism he wore like armor, but his eyes betrayed a deep-seated weariness. The human hum of distant announcements and the murmurs of passing travelers faded as memories flooded his mind. He recalled the pivotal presentation he had given 5 years prior at Pinnacle Consulting. He'd developed a groundbreaking strategy poised to revolutionize market approaches that had benefited the Performing Arts Academy for 100 years before and since. A moment in the sun's glare, President Sullivan had ridden up for promotions to take over much of Michael's previous leadership and litigated the field. His contributions were overshadowed. His colleague, Michael Reynolds, who had repackaged Emmanuel's ideas, was lauded and elevated to senior management. "It was never just about the work," Emmanuel whispered, fingers tracing the crease of his trousers. The sting of that betrayal lingered. A reminder that excellence and diligence were not always enough. Beside him, Alvin stared blankly at the scuffed floor tiles, his fingers anxiously tapping his knee. A childhood memory surfaced, sharp and poignant. In 7th grade, when a textbook went missing, he was the only student singled out for questioning. Despite his spotless record and top grades, the principal had eyed him with suspicion. "We just need you to be honest with us, Alvin," the principal had said, the implication clear despite the gentle tone. It wasn't the first time he'd felt the weight of misplaced blame, but it was the first time he understood the unsettling reality of being judged before being known. Xavier sat on the other side, his sketchbook open on his lap. His usually steady hands moved with a frenetic energy, charcoal pencil etching bold lines across the page. The abstract forms took shape, jagged edges and overlapping shadows capturing the turmoil within. He remembered the Soho gallery where his art was once showcased, or rather hidden. His work had been deemed too provocative and relegated to a dim corner, away from the main exhibits. "Your pieces might be better appreciated in a more intimate setting," the curator had explained, a thin veil over the truth. The rejection wasn't of his art, it was of the narratives his art dared to confront. "Do you think any of this is by chance?" Xavier's voice broke the shared silence, his gaze fixed on the chaotic lines of his drawing. Alvin glanced up. "No, it's a pattern. A familiar one." Emmanuel nodded slowly. "We've all been here before, in one way or another." Their words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken understanding. Strangers just hours before, now bound by a shared experience that was both personal and collective. An airline representative approached hesitantly, clutching a clipboard as if it were a lifeline. "Gentlemen," she began, her practiced smile faltering under their steady gazes, "we need to document the incident for our records. Could you each provide a statement about what happened on the plane?" Emmanuel's eyes hardened. "We've already been unjustly removed from our flight based on a vague complaint," he replied evenly. "Now you want us to recount it for your paperwork." She shifted uncomfortably. "I understand this is frustrating, but—" "No, I don't think you do understand," Xavier interjected, closing his sketchbook with a decisive snap. "If you did, we wouldn't be in this situation." Alvin took a deep breath, reining in his simmering frustration. "We'll provide our statements," he said quietly. "But we expect this matter to be addressed seriously." The representative nodded, relief evident in her expression. "Of course, please follow me." As they stood to follow, the three men exchanged a glance, a silent agreement forming between them. Several minutes later, they found themselves seated around a small conference table in a sterile office space. One by one they recounted the events, the abrupt requests to leave the plane, the lack of a valid explanation, the insinuation that they were responsible for an unpleasant odor despite being seated separately and not interacting. When the statements were taken, the representative offered the same non-committal assurances. "We will investigate this matter thoroughly." Emmanuel leaned forward. "And what does that entail exactly?" She faltered. "Well, we have procedures that often lead nowhere," Xavier finished for her. Alvin stood up. "We appreciate your time," he said, his tone making it clear that the conversation was over. Outside the office, the trio paused. The bustling sounds of the airport felt distant, muted by the weight of their collective resolve. "This can't end here," Xavier said, his eyes flashing with determination. "We can't let them sweep this under the rug." Emmanuel nodded. "Agreed. We need to take action, not just for us, but for everyone who can't speak up." Alvin pulled out his phone. "I have connections with a journalist who covers civil rights issues. She might be interested in our story." "And I can reach out to some legal contacts," Emmanuel added. "There may be grounds for a discrimination lawsuit." Xavier tapped his sketchbook. "I'll use my art to shed light on this. People connect with stories in different ways." They exchanged contact information, the initial barriers between them dissolved by a shared purpose. What began as individual frustrations had evolved into a unified stand against systemic injustice. As they parted ways to pursue their respective avenues, there was a sense of momentum, a feeling that, together, they could turn this personal affront into meaningful change. Emmanuel watched as Alvin and Xavier disappeared into the crowd, then glanced down at his own reflection in the polished floor. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone in facing it. The afternoon sun filtered through the large windows of the quiet cafe where Emmanuel, Alvin, and Xavier had agreed to meet. The soft hum of conversations and the clinking of cups provided a calming backdrop to the weighty matters at hand. Emmanuel spread out a series of documents he'd printed. "I did some research last night," he began, his voice measured. "There are precedent cases where airlines have been sued for racial discrimination. If we approach this strategically, we can make a strong case." Alvin sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Legal action is a serious step," he mused. "It could draw a lot of attention, not all of it positive." Xavier leaned forward, eyes intense. "We can't let fear stop us. This isn't just about us three. It's about confronting a system that allows this behavior." Emmanuel nodded. "I agree. We have an opportunity to speak up not just for ourselves, but for others who've faced similar discrimination." Alvin glanced between them. "I suppose staying silent has its own risks. Nothing changes." "Exactly," Xavier said firmly. "Art is my usual medium for expression, but this requires more direct action." Emmanuel tapped a name on one of the documents. "I've contacted Camila Rodriguez, a civil rights attorney. She's agreed to meet with us this afternoon." Alvin raised an eyebrow. "That was quick." "I didn't want to lose momentum," Emmanuel replied. "Time is of the essence in cases like this." Later that day, the trio arrived at the law offices of Rodriguez and Associates. The building was unassuming, a brick facade with large windows reflecting the city streets. Inside, the atmosphere was professional yet inviting. Camila Rodriguez greeted them with a firm handshake. "I've reviewed the brief summary Emmanuel sent over," she said as she led them to a conference room. "I'm sorry you've had to experience this." The conference room was modest, with a large wooden table surrounded by high-backed chairs. Sunlight streamed in, casting a glow on the stacks of legal texts lining the shelves. "Please, have a seat," Camila offered. Once they were settled, she continued, "What happened to you is not an isolated incident. Unfortunately, racial profiling in air travel is more common than many realize." Emmanuel nodded. "We want to hold them accountable, but we're not sure of the best way to proceed." Camila leaned forward. We can file a discrimination lawsuit against the airline. We'll allege that you were removed from the flight based solely on a baseless complaint that was a pretext for racism. Alvin shifted in his seat. I'm concerned about the publicity. How might this affect our personal and professional lives? That's a valid concern, Camila acknowledged. There may be media attention, but we can manage that carefully. Sometimes public awareness can actually aid our cause. Xavier opened his sketchbook, revealing a drawing he'd been working on, a powerful depiction of three figures standing against a faceless crowd. If it helps, I can use my art to convey our message, to humanize our experience. Camila smiled appreciatively. Art can be a profound tool for social justice. It could amplify our impact. They spent the next hour outlining the steps ahead. Camila explained the legal process, the importance of gathering evidence, and the potential challenges they might face. We'll need detailed accounts from each of you, she said. Any correspondence with the airline, witness statements from other passengers if possible, and documentation of how this incident has affected you. Emmanuel was prepared. I've started compiling information, changes in the boat passage, flight details, the names of the crew members involved, even some contacts of passengers who might be willing to testify. Alvin offered a tentative smile. I can reach out to colleagues in the industry. Discreetly, of course. Maybe someone has advice or can connect us with additional resources. Camila looked at each of them in turn. Your commitment is important. These cases can be lengthy and emotionally taxing, but they can also lead to meaningful change. As they wrapped up the meeting, there was a palpable sense of purpose in the room. The initial shock and frustration had been channeled into a focused plan of action. Outside the law firm, the city bustled around them. Xavier took a deep breath. I feel hopeful, unfulfilled. Emmanuel adjusted his tie, his gaze thoughtful. We're taking control of the narrative. Alvin nodded, and we're doing it together. The three men parted ways with a promise to stay in close contact. They knew the road ahead would not be easy, but they also knew that by uniting their efforts, they stood a better chance at confronting the injustice they'd faced. That evening, Emmanuel sat by his apartment window, the city lights twinkling against the night sky. He reflected on the unexpected turn his life had taken in just a short time. Reaching for his laptop, he began drafting a detailed account of the incident, ensuring that no detail was overlooked. Across town, Alvin shared a quiet dinner with his family. His wife listened intently as he recounted the day's events. I'm proud of you, she said softly, squeezing his hand. You're standing up for what's right. Xavier stood in his studio, surrounded by canvases. He selected a large blank one and began to paint, bold strokes conveying the complex emotions swirling within him. His art would be his voice in this fight, a testament to resilience and a call for justice. As the night deepened, each man prepared in his own way for the challenges ahead. Their individual strengths, Emmanuel's strategic mind, Alvin's thoughtful pragmatism, Xavier's creative passion, would be their collective advantage. They were no longer solitary figures navigating the aftermath of discrimination. Together, they had formed a coalition, a force poised to confront not just an airline, but a pervasive system of bias. The journey would be arduous, but their resolve was unwavering. The filing of their lawsuit sent shockwaves through Emmanuel, Alvin, and Xavier's lives, the repercussions unfolding like ripples across a still pond, touching every corner of their personal and professional worlds. End. Emmanuel sat alone in his apartment, the glow of his laptop casting a pale light on his face amidst the evening shadows. His eyes scanned the email for the third time, each reading no less painful than the last. Dear Mr. Jean Joseph, we appreciate your interest and the time you've invested in interviewing with us. However, due to recent developments, we've decided to move forward with other candidates. We wish you the best in your future endeavors. Sincerely, the recruitment team." He leaned back, exhaling slowly as frustration mingled with a steely resolve. The job and opportunity he'd meticulously pursued had evaporated, not because of his qualifications, but because of his stand against discrimination. Emmanuel recognized this setback for what it was, a subtle reprimand for challenging the status quo. "It's not just a rejection," he murmured. "It's a message." Across town, Alvin sat in the familiar setting of his weekly consulting meeting. Yet the atmosphere felt unmistakably different. Colleagues who once greeted him with warmth now offered tight-lipped smiles and avoided eye contact. Whispers hushed as he entered the room, replaced by an awkward silence that only magnified his isolation. After the meeting, his team leader, Michael Richardson, approached him with a forced casualness. "Alvin, could we chat for a moment?" Michael gestured toward a quiet corner. "Of course," Alvin replied, though he already sensed the direction of the conversation. Michael cleared his throat. "Listen, some of the partners have expressed concerns about, well, the publicity surrounding your lawsuit." Alvin met his gaze steadily. "And what are those concerns exactly?" "Just that it might reflect on the firm," Michael said, shifting his weight. "Clients might question our stability or get uneasy about any potential media attention." Alvin paused before responding, choosing his words carefully. "I understand the firm's position, but addressing systemic discrimination shouldn't be seen as a liability. It's an issue that affects all of us, including our clients." Michael offered a non-committal nod. "Just keep us in the loop, okay?" "Of course," Alvin replied, though he knew the underlying message was clear. In his studio, Xavier stood before a massive canvas, the scent of oils and acrylics permeating the air. Bold strokes of deep reds and stark blacks collided on the canvas, forming abstract figures that seemed to both clash and meld together. It was his most ambitious piece yet, a visual manifesto born from their shared ordeal. His phone buzzed incessantly on the workbench, notifications flashing from social media and news outlets picking up their story. There were messages of support, but also others laced with thinly veiled hostility. One message caught his eye from the gallery curator. "Given the recent developments, we're considering postponing your exhibition until things settle down." Xavier frowned, his jaw tightening. He typed a swift reply. "No postponements. The exhibition proceeds as planned. These developments make it all the more important." Setting the phone aside, he refocused on his painting, channeling his frustration and hope into every brushstroke. The media quickly latched onto their lawsuit, propelling the three men into an unanticipated spotlight. News articles and television segments debated the merits of their case, while social media buzzed with hashtags both supporting and criticizing their actions. Camila Rodriguez stood before a cluster of microphones at a press conference, poised and unflappable. "This case isn't merely about an airline dispute," she declared. "It's about confronting a systemic issue that has been ignored for too long. My clients have shown tremendous courage in standing up, not just for themselves, but for the countless others who have faced similar injustices." Emmanuel, Alvin, and Xavier began meeting regularly, their individual journeys entwining more deeply as they navigated the challenges ahead. Sitting around a small table in a quiet cafe one evening, they shared updates and offered encouragement. "I'm sorry about the job," Alvin said to Emmanuel. "That's incredibly unfair." Emmanuel shrugged lightly. "It's a setback, but it only reinforces why this fight is necessary." Xavier leaned forward. "I've been thinking we should harness this attention constructively. Maybe host a community forum or partner with advocacy groups." Alvin nodded thoughtfully. "Education is key. If we can raise awareness, perhaps we can prevent others from facing what we did." Emmanuel's eyes gleamed with renewed purpose. Agreed. Let's use every platform we have. Yet with the support also came opposition. Emmanuel began receiving anonymous emails warning him to drop the lawsuit. One afternoon, as he walked home, he noticed a black car trailing slowly behind him. It turned the next corner, but the unease lingered. Alvin found anonymous notes slipped under his door at work, typed messages suggesting he know his place. He brought them to Michael, hoping for support, but was met with indifference. Probably just a prank, Michael dismissed. Try not to let it distract you. Feeling increasingly isolated at the firm, Alvin began to question whether his values aligned with his workplace. Despite the mounting pressures, the three men found strength in their solidarity. They attended Xavier's art exhibition together, standing amidst a crowd that buzzed with conversations about social justice and change. Xavier's centerpiece, a striking tableau titled Emergence, captured their journey with haunting beauty. As they stood before the painting, a young woman approached them. "Your story inspired me," she said softly. "Thank you for standing up." Her words reaffirmed the impact of their actions. One evening they gathered at Emmanuel's apartment, poring over legal documents while the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the room. "Our court date is set," Emmanuel announced. "Camila believes we have a strong case." Alvin sighed, a mix of anxiety and anticipation. "Are we ready for this?" Xavier placed a hand on his shoulder. "We've come this far together. We'll face whatever comes next the same way." Emmanuel raised his mug. To resilience. They clinked their cups together, a silent vow unspoken yet understood. The ripple effects of their lawsuit continued to expand, challenging them, changing them. They faced professional risks, personal insecurities, and external threats. Yet, amidst the turbulence, they also discovered a profound sense of purpose. Their journey was no longer just about seeking justice for themselves. It was about igniting a broader conversation, inspiring others to stand against discrimination, and contributing to a movement larger than any one of them. As they looked ahead to the legal battles and societal challenges looming on the horizon, they knew the path would not be easy, but together they felt equipped to navigate the storms. "This is just the beginning," Emmanuel said, his voice filled with conviction. "And we're not turning back," Alvin affirmed. Xavier smiled softly. Onward, then. The morning sun bathed the steps of the federal courthouse in a golden glow, casting elongated shadows that intertwined like the lives of those gathering below. The building stood as an imposing symbol of justice, its marble columns and grand facade both inspiring and intimidating. For Emmanuel, Alvin, and Xavier, this was more than just a courthouse. It was the stage for a pivotal moment in their collective journey. Emmanuel adjusted his tie, the crisp navy fabric contrasting sharply against his white shirt. His suit, meticulously chosen, served as his armor, a familiar symbol of professionalism and competence. Yet today it also represented his transformation from a corporate strategist to an advocate for justice. He took a deep breath, his gaze steady as he surveyed the steps. "Hard to believe we've come this far," he said quietly. Alvin stood beside him, hands clasped in front of him. His usual calm demeanor was tinged with a solemn resolve. "We've stepped onto a path that chose us as much as we chose it," he replied. "No turning back now." Xavier joined them, a sketchbook tucked under his arm. Instead of drawing, he'd begun capturing moments with a vintage camera slung over his shoulder. "I thought a new medium might be fitting for today," he explained with a faint smile. "Sometimes change calls for a different lens." They entered the courthouse together, passing through security and into the vast corridors lined with portraits of solemn-faced judges and historical figures. The air was thick with the quiet tension of legal battles being waged behind heavy wooden doors. In the courtroom, their attorney, Camila Rodriguez, was setting up at the plaintiff's table. She greeted them with a confident nod. "Everything is in place," she assured them. "Remember, speak your truth plainly and confidently." The courtroom slowly filled, spectators, journalists, supporters, and a few unfamiliar faces whose intentions were unclear. The defendants counted about 9,000 at the time, representatives from the airline JFS Francis P. Hall and the representatives from the airline. Representatives from the airline JFS, representatives from the airline POSS, sat with their legal team on the opposite side, their expressions professionally neutral. The judge entered the room, taking orders from the lawyers. For the proceeding, orders. A woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that hinted at both wisdom and weariness. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. Camila began with her opening statement, her voice clear and unwavering. "Your Honor, we are here today not just to address the wrongful actions taken against my clients, but to shed light on a pattern of discrimination that has too often been ignored." Emmanuel was the first to take the stand. Camila guided him through his testimony, allowing his words to paint a vivid picture of the events and their impact. "Mr. Jean-Joseph," she began, "can you describe the immediate aftermath of the incident for the court?" He nodded. "Following our removal from the flight without valid explanation, I found myself questioning my worth and my place. Professionally, opportunities I'd been pursuing were suddenly withdrawn. It was as if advocating for myself made me a liability. How did that make you feel?" "Frustrated, isolated, but also determined. It became clear that this was about more than just me. It was about challenging a system that allows such injustices to occur." The defense attorney attempted to undermine his credibility, suggesting overreaction or misinterpretation. Emmanuel remained composed, countering with facts and a calm demeanor that resonated with the jury. Alvin was next. His testimony delved into the personal toll, the strain on his family, the shift in how colleagues perceived him. "Mr. Jackson," Camila asked, "have you experienced any professional repercussions as a result of standing up against this discrimination?" "Yes," he admitted. "I've been subtly marginalized at work, passed over for projects, excluded from meetings. It's as if taking a stand labeled me as problematic." "Do you regret your decision to pursue this case?" He glanced briefly at Emmanuel and Xavier before responding. "No. While the consequences have been challenging, the cost of silence would have been far greater." Xavier's turn brought a different energy to the courtroom. Instead of sitting in the witness chair, he stood beside an easel where one of his paintings was displayed, an abstract piece titled "Resilience." "Art has always been my voice," he explained. "This piece represents the journey from oppression to empowerment, not just for us, but for everyone who has ever been marginalized." Sometimes media explains the art's relevance by these two words, non-conformity and becoming. Camila allowed silence to fill the room, giving space for the artwork to speak. The judge regarded the painting thoughtfully before allowing the proceedings to continue. The defense's cross-examinations were met with steadfastness. Each man held firm, their unified front unshaken by attempts to discredit them. As the day's session concluded, the judge addressed the court. "I commend both parties for their presentations today. Cases like this are not just about the individuals involved, but speak to larger societal issues that affect us all. We will reconvene tomorrow." Exiting the courthouse, the trio was met by a crowd of supporters and media. Camila advised them to make a brief statement. Emmanuel stepped forward. "We took this stand because we believe in justice and equality. Our hope is that by sharing our story, we can contribute to meaningful change." Reporters shouted questions, but they moved on, choosing not to engage further. That evening, they gathered at a local community center, where a forum had been organized to discuss racial profiling and discrimination. The room was filled with diverse faces, activists, community leaders, students, and elders. An elderly man approached them. his eyes bright despite the lines etched by time. "Thank you for what you're doing," he said. "I've seen a lot in my years, and it's heartening to see the younger generation continuing the fight." Xavier clasped the man's hand. "We're building on the foundation you and others laid," he replied. "It's a shared journey." As the night progressed, stories were shared, some heartbreaking, others inspiring. The trio realized that their battle in court was just one facet of a much larger movement. Emmanuel took a moment to reflect. This started as a response to a personal injustice, but it's become so much more. Alvin nodded. "We're part of a tapestry now, one thread among many, each strengthening the whole." Xavier added, "And together we're creating something profoundly impactful." Back at his apartment, Emmanuel sat by the window, city lights twinkling like stars brought down to earth. He felt a mix of exhaustion and fulfillment. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he felt aligned with a purpose greater than himself. A message pinged on his phone, a text from his sister. "Proud of you. Keep shining." He smiled, the simple words reaffirming his resolve. Meanwhile, Alvin returned home to his family. His wife met him at the door with a warm embrace. "How did it go?" she asked. "As well as it could have," he replied. "There's still a long way to go, but I feel hopeful." She squeezed his hand. "We're with you, every step." Xavier spent the late hours in his studio, channeling the day's events into a new piece. Colors swirled and merged on the canvas, echoes of the conversations and emotions that had filled the courthouse and community center. As dawn approached, he stepped back to view his work, a vivid portrayal of unity amidst adversity. It wasn't just art, it was a reflection of their journey and the transformations they were undergoing. The first light of morning cast a gentle glow through the studio windows. Xavier felt a serene determination settle within him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew they wouldn't face them alone. The legal proceedings had come to an end. The courtroom was packed to capacity. Journalists, activists, supporters, and simply curious city residents. The atmosphere was tense and expectant. Emmanuel, Alvin, and Xavier sat alongside their attorney, Camila Rodriguez. In the past months, they had endured much: professional hardships, personal doubts, public pressure. But they stood together, united by a common goal. The judge entered the room, and everyone rose. After the formalities, she began to deliver the verdict. After careful consideration of the case, witness testimonies, and presented evidence, the court concludes that the actions of American Airlines toward the plaintiffs were unjustified and racially discriminatory. A hush fell over the room. The hearts of the three men beat faster. The court orders that the airline must issue a public apology to the plaintiffs, pay compensation for moral damages, and conduct mandatory training for its staff on racial sensitivity and the inadmissibility of discrimination. Emmanuel closed his eyes, feeling relief. This was confirmation that their struggle had not been in vain. Under the table, Alvin clenched his hands into fists, holding back emotions. All the sacrifices and risks he had taken for this moment now seemed justified. Xavier smiled, feeling hope for the first time in a long while. His gaze met those of Emmanuel and Alvin. They nodded to each other, acknowledging their shared victory. After the session, they stepped out onto the courthouse steps, where journalists awaited them. "How do you feel after the court's decision?" one of the reporters asked, extending a microphone. Alvin stepped forward. "We are grateful to the justice system for fairness. We hope that this decision will serve as a warning to other companies and a step toward eliminating systemic discrimination." Emmanuel added, "This is a victory not only for us, but for all who have faced similar injustice. We urge everyone not to remain silent and to fight for their rights." Xavier raised his hand, in which he held a small painting. "Art and action can change the world." This experience has inspired me to continue creating and speaking the truth. In the following weeks, the consequences of the court's decision were palpable. The airline issued an official statement with apologies and announced new initiatives for staff training. Emmanuel received offers from companies that valued his principles and determination. He chose a position in an organization dedicated to promoting diversity and inclusion in the corporate environment. Alvin decided to found his own consulting firm specializing in workplace equity. His experience and knowledge were in demand, and he quickly assembled a team of like-minded individuals. Xavier held his exhibition, which became a true event. His works, reflecting struggle and victory, attracted widespread attention. He became the voice of a generation, using art as a tool for social change. One evening, they met again in the same cafe where it all began. The atmosphere was significantly lighter. They smiled, laughed, and reminisced about the journey they had taken. "Who would have thought where that flight would lead us?" Alvin said, raising his cup of coffee. "Life is full of unexpected turns," Emmanuel replied. "But what's important is how we respond to them." "I'm glad we went through this together," Xavier added. "It changed us, and perhaps made the world a little better." They sat for a long time, discussing future plans, new projects, and ideas. Their friendship, forged in challenging circumstances, had become strong and sincere. The story of three men who faced injustice and decided to fight had reached its logical conclusion. They not only achieved justice for themselves, but also inspired others to combat prejudice and discrimination.